Worldpeacefull, and today's subject is economics. But before we have a look at economics, I'm going to just do some breathing to still my mind so that I can contemplate this subject with a bit more depth. So firstly, just breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in inspiration, breathing out stress, stilling the mind. Just being with the now moment. No future, no past, just what is. I remember doing a 10-day silent retreat. Most people who know me, I'm a talker, thought that might be impossible for me to be silent, but it actually wasn't hard at all. I've actually chosen to have a life on my own anyway, so I actually see my home as my ashram. And the reason I've been thinking about this lately, the reason why I've chosen to be alone, and it's been over 15 years now, is that I want to be able to get clarity around who I am. I want to sort of step away from the noise and to look at myself, with the various layers of conditioning that I've been subject to from childhood. And of course, those layers of conditioning are for all people: your culture, your education, your parents, your schooling. All these things shape our minds. They shape our worldview to the point that it's very difficult when you've been living in these rhythms for so long, hundreds, really, 300,000 years. It's been certain modes of thinking. Certainly the Industrial Revolution onwards has been the industrial type thinking. But we think our thoughts are our own, and in reality they're not. They've been given to us by others who have thought them, and we call that education or socialisation. So I'm kind of asking you really just to pause for a moment and just open your mind to the possibility that there are things that you do not know, the knowing of which would change everything. When you've grown up, like I have, I've grown up here in Australia, where material needs have been met, even though I came from a working class family. We certainly weren't hungry, but my parents worked a lot. And I grew up really in a very clean city. It's a new city. Australia's quite a new country, so Canberra is where I'm originally from, the capital. Things were fairly simple and straightforward. The family was, at that time, the father went out to work, the mother raised the children in those days. Despite what others might think in other cultures, we actually had, certainly in my mother's generation and my grandparents' generation, bigger families. There was a much greater sense of community. People weren't so materialistic. Certainly there wasn't the expectation that people should work. And even when I was growing up, my parents didn't consider career for me. My mother was a typist and my father was a printer, so we would have been classified as working class, blue collar workers from my market analyst days. But nonetheless, my parents' thinking was governed by the times they grew up in, and of course the advent of television was a very powerful influencer of thoughts that I would say many people are taking on board as true, when really it's just television coming from certain segments of society in certain countries. Predominantly the United States would be a very major producer of programming. And programming is a good word because that's what's happened largely. So that sort of brings me to the subject of economics. Now, I actually studied marketing and economics at what you would call high school and college. And because I was good at it, I ended up going on to do a degree in economics at a university here in Australia. And at the time I was very interested in macroeconomics. I was interested in the politics, but on the global level was what interested me. I studied supply and demand curves, which were constructed as a means of optimizing through demand how much was supplied. So price was set on the basis of demand and supply intersecting, based on literally what people were wanting and what was available. There were principles in economics where, it was considered those countries that could supply certain resources more efficiently should be the ones to supply it. It was the law of comparative advantage, I believe. It's been a while since I've done economics, so I'm going back. But, pricing was pretty much designed on trying to optimize resources rather than just waste them, prior to the economic system, based on, really Adam Smith's invisible hand, which is demand and supply. That came in because prior to that, I believe the mercantilists, who were traders, were basically setting price the way they wanted it. And I'm imagining in that time there was power through control and conquest. Democracy was not known. It was pretty much the law of the jungle in those days, and those who were more violent, more aggressive, were the ones that typically won the spoils. And as a counter to that, various revolutions have happened where people have risen up because their conditions were so bad and they were seeking to move out of deep and entrenched poverty. And so insurrection arose, and eventually different ways of thinking arose through the advent of democracy. The idea of sharing power rather than a dictatorial state of governance. They found that with the sharing of power through a democratic representative system where people get to choose, there was less insurrection. They were able to gain greater social stability because people were generally happy, getting their needs met. And liberties were considered the most important fruits of a democratic type of system. The right to liberty, the right to freedom. The United States, the right to life, liberty and happiness was the founding fathers in that country, which were very noble and honourable beginnings. Of course, we all have the right to freedom. We're actually born free. We're free thinkers. Every human being has their own thoughts. That's their freedom. And even those who seek to control thought through punishing those that come up with different thought, they can't stop that person thinking. They can't know what they're thinking. Therefore, they can never have absolute control over anybody's thought, although people will keep it quiet because they don't want to be persecuted. They've seen what happens to those who speak up. And yet it'll never be stopped. And in fact, the more oppression that occurs, you will see the cracks appear. People will speak up because they've been hurt in some way. Maybe a family member's been killed, or they're seeing that this is really an affront to who they are. And that's how individuals rise. They think that they must rise up in order to change things because the situation's intolerable or unbearable. The idea of economics, really when it arose out of the agrarian age, out of the trading, process, economics really was to distribute resources around the world more equitably, However, as we've come to see, there are growing distortions in the economic system, and some of the key weaknesses would be the encouragement of greed. I think of Gordon Gekko here. Greed is good. Stock market, make as much money as you can. And I understand where that's come from, this sort of sense of abundance. And that's why the system was so successful, I think, was deep down we all like that feeling of abundance, that we can go to a shop and buy what we want and feel security through access to resources. And those who have lived in very, very poor countries and are living there today would know the insecurity of not having enough. But at the same time, I've also seen there's great ingenuity in the poorest of people, and they're incredibly resilient and incredibly capable of creating something out of nothing. I certainly don't see them as inferior. I see them as different, and I see them as having a much more profound sense of community that in the West we don't have. In fact, the sense of community on the basis of a material life is really declining because people are valuing things over people. They are valuing success as having money and possessions and nice homes and nice cars and being seen to be, and mixing with the right people is seen to be success. And so those who are perceived as not successful, who are not, reflecting those sorts of attributes, are seen as less in some way. And of course, none of that is true. Everybody is equal in truth, and we're here to have different and diverse life experiences. And from the harshest situations, the most amazing triumphs can arise. I mean, I see success as finding happiness in life. Personally, I see gross national happiness as probably the greatest success. If you can be happy in your life, not as a fabricated joy where you've got this thing and that thing and then you've got the next thing and the next thing after that and you feel happy. I mean to be able to sit alone in a room and feel joy in life, or even just go for a walk and feel incredible joy rising up within you. Making peace with who you are is actually the highest success. But most of us are busy chasing after things. I remember a friend from Afghanistan telling me when he saw people jogging, he goes, "Look, they're running after their health." And I thought, I never thought of that. And yeah, he's right. They're trying to be healthy, so they're running like mad. But in truth, they're actually stressed out from their jobs, and they're trying to release the stress. And many of them end up with knee injuries and all sorts because they really don't know how to face this incessant demand on their life to work harder and harder and harder. And whilst they might be on salaries, their hourly rate is falling and falling as they work longer and longer. And interestingly enough, with the technological revolution, the IT revolution, I remember writing a paper when I was studying economics on the leisure society. Apparently life was to get easier as we had more technology, labour-saving devices, which is what all this is about. We were supposed to have more time to relax. But what we've seen globally happen is because there's very poor countries in the world, they can compete on price because labour is cheap. And in those segments of the marketplace where price is really important, like a low price is where they get market share, then clearly those countries are going to do a lot better. And China would be a case in point. The Asian tigers were another case in point. Korea did very, very well with its Takeovers, which are the big multinationals that it had, and a very organised governance and business relationship where they were very much poised to maximise economic growth. And of course, Japan, under the Marshall Plan after the war, Second World War, were given assistance to rebuild after they were bombed by these nuclear bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is very, very tragic what happened, and started the nuclear age in a sense when those weapons were detonated on civilians. Japan had to rebuild after the Second World War when it surrendered. And of course, unconditional surrender for them was not possible because they couldn't give up Hirohito. However, as it turned out after the war, Hirohito they didn't need to give up Hirohito. They could have had a conditional surrender and perhaps nuclear situation could have been avoided. But we often get blinded by control and fear. And of course, you know, the great carnage of the Second World War was 80 million people were killed. But out of that, you know, industrialization increased, particularly in the United States and, of course, in Japan, where they were being rebuilt. And they also, interestingly enough, as a result of that, created the first peace constitution in the world, where they were not to take up arms. And I do believe in Iraq they did send in troops. But I was interested in that idea to really work for peace, coming out of violence. You know, maybe we can start to think more deeply about what real peace is. But going back to the economic situation, what we've seen is it's emerged from the trading nations that have become multinational companies, which can actually trade from multiple countries. They buy up multiple businesses. It's not always easy to know which company owns which one because the takeovers are quite complicated in the world. And even within some of these very, very large multinational companies, they're actually the size of nation states in terms of their economic value. And what they can do is drop the cost of production through transfer pricing, I believe, internally in those companies. You know, so they can buy up a chain, for example. They can buy up the raw material supplier. They can buy up the processing company. They can buy up the factory, the retailer, and then it's sold to the customer. So if they control that marketing channel, they can control price all the way down. If there are smaller competitors in that industry, well, they often will fall by the wayside because they can't compete with the buying power of very big companies. And of course, with great wealth can come attitudes of superiority. Bullying can happen where companies can influence, nation states, governance, and often do, in order to gain advantages through taxation or access to resources or, knowing the right people, creating, collaborative arrangements. And that seems to be the way of business. I kind of wanted to discuss a little bit about greed because what we're facing here right now is a situation where the environment is being denuded, diluted, destroyed, damaged, polluted, eroded, you name it. Environmentally, I think it was Al Gore that said that the atmosphere was some sort of dumping ground for pollutants and chemicals. This disconnect through greed, and of course what greed is I want more and more and more and more and more, and even that's not enough, so we need more. And status is attached to that because I've got more and more. It's very impressive, I've got all these cars, I've got all these businesses, I'm making millions of dollars, I've got power, I can influence governments, I can go and get a meeting with the minister. And that's all because I'm perceived as a powerful person, given how much money I have and given the whole system is set up on money. The money system, medium of exchange. And so greed has come in where I just want more and more of that. And in actual fact, if you look at it psychologically, it's actually ego. The egoic consciousness separates itself from others. So it can detach from any impacts its decisions make. And that's how people can do, various behaviours that are undermining of societies or destructive of populations, because they disconnect emotionally from the suffering of others, and they may well have psychological justifications. They would have to have that in order to justify their behaviour. And they may say, well, you know, we're generating jobs and it's good for the economy, even though they might be polluting rivers. There might be all sorts of tailings going in. So the sort of juggernaut, this mindset of more and removing any sort of strategic obstacles, because it becomes like a bit of a game. And they do see game, they use game theory and certainly strategic marketing. They also use military terminology, you know, flank attacks. I studied strategic marketing. I was amazed by that. You know, they saw the competitor as the enemy. So then we, instead of fighting them with bombs, you know, it becomes undermining the competitor through pricing or getting their secrets through spying. So what's changing here? And, you know, are we really seeing ourselves, you know, through this behaviour? Has this behaviour really changed? So in the conquest through violence, you know, we call it peacetime, and we do it through economics. I mean, quite a lot of people jump out the window, you know, when the Wall Street crashes, because they really believe their identity is attached to money, to wealth. And if they lose all of that, they believe they've lost everything, which I think is really tragic, that people think that who they are is what they have. Nothing could be further from the truth. Who you are is actually love in form, meaning who you really are is a living, breathing, loving, interacting human being, going through all these emotional states as you travel through life. And you really are here to have a journey. I mean, we're all here to have an experience and to learn something. So, you know, if I look at a corporate, I don't look at them with disdain. I see that someone is having an experience as a corporate executive, and this is their universe. And for them, these things are very important. They've invested a lot of their time and education and energy and identity in what they do. And so if you were to pull them aside and say, well, I'm going to take all this away from you and you need to reinvent yourself. And this, of course, happens when people have disasters in their life, where they lose everything. They find themselves totally shattered, and many have nervous breakdowns. And some may suicide because they just can't cope with the thought of not knowing who they are anymore. So people kind of cleave to this sense of identity, like, you know, wearing clothing. They feel naked without it. And they feel completely vulnerable when what they're used to, what the comforts that they've had have been removed. And yet if they were to adopt a mindset of I'm not in control of life, which is actually the truth, despite how it looks, we think we're in control because there's a rhythm to it and same things keep turning up each day. But in actual fact, we're on a planet, you know, orbiting a sun in a universe, and anything can happen. We're not in control. We can't predict from one moment to the next what's going to happen, although we put systems in place where there appears to be a rhythm of routine, and that appears to be secure and ordered. But as I was saying earlier, we're in a situation today where the environment is collapsing. Now, some people, which I find really interesting, they're the most interesting ones, who say, no, it's not happening, it's not happening. And look, my mind's open, and who am I to say I'm right? I might be wrong, very possibly. I just know that when I was up in the Himalayas a few years ago, the ice is melting up there, and I know that tribal people who've been there for a long time are moving. Apparently the ice is melting at different times, and they're experiencing drought, which is unheard of in the Himalayas. It's, you know, it's snow covered. You know, there's a lot of water. That water actually supplies the whole of Asia. You know, you think of the subcontinent there, India and Pakistan, and, you know, the nearly, what is it, over 1 billion people, a lot of people living in that part of the world. Now, if water becomes a problem because of climate change, well, then we're going to have some interesting situations arise. And of course, people are talking on the other side that, there'll be wars over water. But my hope is that we might evolve a little bit and start to understand that we're all one on this planet. We are all one on this planet, and what we do to others, we do to ourselves. And it's not about competing to survive. It should be about cooperating to live in ways where everybody benefits. I mean, at the moment, we're in a mentality of competition, which has been deeply embedded in our psyche. You might remember me talking about socialisation and education, where we think in certain ways. Competition would be one of those things that's been deeply embedded, particularly in the industrial age. Oh, even prior to that, actually, with conquest. Men particularly competing to feel some sense of success, some sense of I'm beating the other, I'm somehow better. And again, that connects to ego, as does greed. But we have to change our thinking in the world that we're in today, and the economic system alone is not going to offer up, if you like, the answers on how to deal with sustainability, how to deal with environmental impacts, how to clean up a planet that's being increasingly destroyed through more and more countries coming online in respect of capitalism. And I know when I travelled the world, I went to third world countries and I could see the various parts of those cities and areas where people were bringing in a lot of credit in order to emulate the West in terms of the department stores that they created without guards outside so the poor people couldn't get in, which I thought was a bit sad in their own country that they're discriminated against on the basis of their deep poverty rather than sharing it. There's sort of these little enclaves, islands of success that only the wealthy and well-to-do, and if you're white like me, I was able to walk in there, and I'm actually would be considered poor in my own country, so I found it interesting. But that's what we do. We get frightened and we compete, and there are winners and there are losers in that mindset. Well, I am right, you are wrong in that mindset. But in order to deal with the changing landscape, literally, in the world today, with the environmental situation arising as a challenge to capitalism and any form of production which extracts from the earth way more than it replaces. And this is extraction without replacement. When we're building in obsolescence into products, in other words, we're building them in such a way that they break down in shorter periods of time, which means we have to buy more things, and that comes from greed. The producer of that item wants that product to last maybe 1 or 2 years, and then it breaks down, so the person has to buy another one. And so more and more things get piled up in those rubbish dumps, and this is not living in harmony with the world, with the planet. The planet's a living, breathing entity. It's actually alive. They called it Gaia for a reason. It's actually a living, interrelated, interconnected system with its own consciousness. We're slowly starting to realise that we're living in the most extraordinary Eden, and that there is purpose, great purpose in the wildlife, in the flora, in the various herbs that could have solved a lot of our medical issues. We seem to be going for the chemicals rather than what's naturally occurring in nature that's been known by Indigenous people for thousands of years. There was great knowledge in those more primitive, supposedly. I don't see them as primitive myself. I actually felt that they were more in harmony with the planet. They were less complicated than we are. We became more complex the more we thought. And we think because we're fearful. We're thinking a lot because we're trying to get advantages. We're trying to go further. We're trying to work it out. But what we kind of missed was our own happiness. And of course, some people listening to this may have heard of Bhutan. Bhutan's known for coining the term gross national happiness. They believe their country is one of the happiest in the world. And of course, what people are starting to discover is that an economic system which only values really money over people, and whilst it has, out of that incentive to make money, great ingenuity can come too. That's true. And we've seen many things arise that appear to be very sophisticated, great technologies. But it's not in harmony with the planet. And what I've certainly witnessed in my own lifetime over the last 20, 30 years, yes, I'm getting on. I've seen a lot. What I've witnessed is people's happiness declining. I myself have worked in 400 companies. I have seen a lot. And I see people looking at the clock, yawning, because they're not happy. They're not happy with the life they're leading, and they've got mortgages to pay. So many of them feel enslaved by it. They don't feel they've got a way out. You know, they've got debt, and that's what keeps them working. But they're not happy. And if we're not happy, which was the original purpose of economics, was the idea was that we were to create a system that gave us resources more cheaply because we distribute it more widely. Demand and supply made sure it was efficient. And the idea there was that people would get their needs and preferences met, and there'd be, you know, much more abundance, much more happiness, because people are finding their needs. So, you know, you can see the principles of it were good. But when greed came in and took over, and corruption, we've seen that right across the planet, in most countries, people's ethical state of play is minimising because they're being rewarded for making money. They're not being rewarded for being good people or being ethical. So it's not surprising to me that ethics has gone by the side. And if communities are breaking down and people aren't staying together in families like we witness in the West as the micro family, I mean, it could be just a single parent family in the end because the father leaves, you know, not knowing how to work as a family unit. Children grow up not knowing what a real family is like, or grandparents and aunts and uncles, you know, all hovering around. And see, this is what creates empathy and sharing, is the notion of living in a little community where everybody is sharing, everybody is apportioning things equally, which is where all this originally arose from, was the community. And as they say, you need a community to raise a child. So what we have today is the economic system taking precedence over the community and the family. And rather than being the servant of the community has now become the servant of the economy, and that's why they're not happy. People feel they've got no choice. They don't feel served. They feel that they've got all these competing demands on their lives. And that's what's putting pressure on a lot of families, you know, and they're breaking up. There's a lot of emotional issues that have not been addressed since their childhood because, particularly in the Western style, you know, the emotional well-being of people was neglected. Stiff upper lip, you know. Many of my father's generation were brought up in conflict and poverty and with great difficulties. And those, you know, particularly for the men, they were not taught how to deal with their emotions other than fighting it out physically through violence or somehow winning through competition and feeling like I'm a bigger person, rather than really looking at the root cause of the insecurity that's driving their sense of lack. And again, this is another key one for economics. You know, it's that sense of lack, the sense that I need to be bigger and better, which isn't really addressing the real need of the human being, which is love and security through loving themselves. Many people are seeking love in all the wrong places. And they've lost a spiritual dimension to their lives too. You know, as religions have been seen as wanting in the sense of, certainly here in Australia, we've had child abuse issues within the churches, you know, where sexuality hasn't been dealt with properly. You know, it's been, if you like, pinched off. Priests couldn't marry, and, you know, sexuality is a very natural thing for human beings. And when it's allowed to be natural, it's a very beautiful thing. It's not this distorted pornography that we see, you know, arising in the world because of distorted sexual fantasy. I mean, it's so sad to see that, because the men even involved in that don't know the beauty of real love and connection. So there's, as you can see just from this discourse, there's a lot of complexity to all of this. There's a lot of reaction to the environments in which we find ourselves, rather than proactive responses and deeper reflection philosophically and spiritually on the world that we've created. And that world is most definitely a reflection of our inner world, where we haven't really dealt with why we feel empty, why we're reaching out for materialism, why we need to be successful to be liked. Why can't we be loved unconditionally for who we are as part of a great diversity, with a deep understanding that every person is on the right path, and that a poor person is not less than a rich person. They're having a different experience. And I certainly know from my own experience, having travelled to 20 countries in the world, maybe more now, 25 I think, what I've seen is enormous wisdom in all people. And I luckily have that attitude of I see everyone as equal anyway. I don't think I'm a Westerner and that I'm better. I'm actually very interested in their lives, and I really love to see the beauty of people smiling. That's, for me, a wealth. If I see happiness, in a moment, or, chatting with someone on the street, or when I worked as a clown, clowning on the street with, incredible people everywhere, I have to say that I just saw incredible beauty everywhere. And I see that as the real wealth. I actually call it the fool's gold. When I see values reflected in respect, empathy, responsibility, honesty, that sense of oneness, that we're all family, a feeling of peace, and great generosity. I've seen the most generosity in third world countries, where they let you stay and they give you a home. I've seen some of the greatest selfishness in very wealthy countries where people don't really care much. And it's just because they're disconnected, that they've lost that sense of empathy, So, if we look at the various parts of the world, I can't say that this part of the world, because it's materially successful, is more successful than the poorest country in the world. I've met people from Afghanistan, which is the poorest country in the world, and I've seen an extraordinary wealth in their relationships with each other. And I've seen kindness and humility and acceptance of me as for who I am, but not trying to make me like them. They were very deeply respectful. But I actually, through their eyes, saw the emptiness in my own world, which was fascinating. So you don't know unless you experience the contrast. So I guess at the end of the day, for everyone listening to this, experience as much as you can and learn as much as you can and keep an open mind. If we want to change the future, ultimately it will boil down to us reconnecting with internal values, such as universal values, which is I am one with the planet, which is what I do to another, I do to myself. Everything's a reflection of me. So if I don't like something that I'm seeing outside of myself, I look at me, not the other. Or I might, rather than judge them, make a higher decision to not engage in that, and I will choose this. Creativity is a wonderful way of responding to things that you might find are quite negative, filled with discord, rather than fighting people. In fact, we can have a world without war, for sure. We can have a world without conflict, actually. And that world is, believe it or not, on the horizon. It's coming. As people start to realise that all conflict begins from within us, and all senses of separation come from ego. So once we transcend ego, and many of the mystics did, they started to realise, they literally realised they were one with the planet. When you become one with the planet, it's literally like the archetypal fool that steps out full of trust, knowing that life supports it. We are in a mindset, of course, that we believe we have to do, to be, to have, whereas the new mindset will be, I need to be. Not even need, you can drop the word need. Be, to do, to have. So I am happy, and things flow out of that. I attract into my world the perfect things that I reflect. It's an energetic, they say it's an energetic vibrational universe. And so this is the new cosmology that's going to be become more, you're going to hear more about it as time goes on. At the moment, we're still in a very material mindset. We're still in, I have to do it all in order to make it happen. If I don't, compete with the best of them, I'm going to be in poverty. In truth, the new and emerging cosmology which is not really new. It's actually ancient in truth, but we've lost connection with it, you know, when we got caught up in the materialism and we disconnected from our spiritual. And all the spiritual side is really just the innately natural part of who we are, which knows it's one with the universe. And I can tell you from my own experience, I travelled Australia alone with a tent, travelled the world alone, and, you know, I had to tap into universal values in order for me to feel at peace, travelling into places I'd never been before and not speaking the language. I can tell you it was challenging. And trusting that I had enough money, you know, that life will provide for my needs. And to my amazement, it did indeed. If I stay at peace and I stay happy and I just accept what is, it's amazing how easy life becomes. I don't have to fight for anything. And so that was why I did the world trip, was to observe the planet. I wanted to have a look at the environmental situation from the sky. I also wanted to study the socio-economic situation in many countries. I wanted to have a look, you know, at how they were faring and the emergence of capitalism around the world, how that was affecting traditional societies, you know, how they were adjusting to this mindset of, you know, which is essentially greed, and it is, and materialism. We're attaching to it. That's all it is. It's just an attachment. The new cosmology will be about non-attachment. It will be about thinking in this way: what I need is what I want. What I have is what I want. What I see in you is in me. What I think about, I attract. All negativity is out of alignment with truth. My true self is love, and when I'm feeling at peace or in joy, I know I'm in alignment with my inner truth. It is an internal navigation. And in fact, our emotions, which have been, for many, cut off, they've been told that it's over-emotional, it's feminine, it's, you know, don't be a girl. We hear that in Australia. And I think to them, what a shame you're not. You'd like it. You know, the emotions is what gives us the feeling of the landscape. It's like being able to touch the world, feel it through your fingertips. You know, feel the sensations of life. This is what life's really about. It's the delicious sensation of being alive, of, you know, singing together, laughing together. This is the colour in the emotional landscape. And sadly, we are told to be professional and to not express these things, but to keep, just hit, isn't that funny? Just laughing at my own self there. Bit of an earthquake with my computer. It must be getting excited. Maybe the computer's getting excited. Anyway, maybe there's consciousness in there too. So, you know, the emotions are really, really important. And when the gorgeous, beautiful men in the world start to connect with their feelings and not see it as a weakness, because God, it's not a weakness. It's your greatest strength, and it makes you the most attractive human being to women. If you feel, women love men that feel their emotions. And I would say to women who critique men crying, I would ask you to change your view on that and encourage it. It's not a weakness, not at all. And in fact, toxins are released through the tear ducts. Now, this might seem way off subject from the economics. It's actually not. The economics is all about structure. The emotional landscape is all about content. And it's the disconnection of the emotions from who we are that's actually created all these, what I would call false needs, where we're trying to get status and identity, etc. When you start to reconnect with your true emotional state of being, joy will arise and you won't need the things you think you need. And my hope would be that what we find really attractive in the world is people who know themselves and are true. You know, people who speak the truth would become the most attractive person. People who have their heart on their sleeve and tell you how they feel without feeling vulnerable and not needing anything from you, just expressing their truth, to me is the highest intelligence. It's not what you have, it's who you are that truly matters. And whilst all these changes might be frightening around the world, even the conflicts and so on, once we come through these difficulties, I do believe we're going to move into a new reality, one that is peaceful and loving, because that is our true nature. We will recalibrate with what is real. And rather than notions such as this being seen as pie in the sky, it'll be seen as, the truth about who we are, because it feels good. So I invite you all to reflect on your own life, follow your passion, be real, tell people the truth, be honest, sit with someone if you're having a problem with them and discuss it, resolve your conflicts. If you feel you want to cry, cry, and don't feel that somehow that's a diminishment of you. It's not. It's just releasing something that doesn't feel good. Sit with all of this. And I want you to remember this part the most. Your happy destiny is unavoidable. Really. It's all good, and we're here to learn. So with that, I will finish. Done nearly an hour. Wow, if you're still listening after this long, that's a good sign for me. Anyway, I'm sending you love. Much love. And talk to you soon.